The chandelier hummed like a beehive over crystal glasses, and every fork was aligned as if the table itself could pass inspection. My mother's heirloom china glowed under warm light. The silver caught every tremor in my hand. When the leather portfolio appeared dark embossed official, my father didn't clear his throat so much as close a door inside himself. "We've made some decisions," he said, and the room tightened. Nathaniel leaned back as if he'd known all along. Olivia's perfume moved like a ribbon through the air. Across the linen, my mother's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Upon our passing," my father continued, "the estate will be divided between Nathaniel and Olivia." The word entirety followed like a period. The crystal did not clink. No one gasped. Somewhere a clock ticked tireless, indifferent correct. Before I go further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever sat at a table where you felt invisible, tap the like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because what came next is why I'm telling this. To understand how that dinner changed the way I breathe, you need to know the house that taught me how to hold it. I grew up in a colonial with white columns and wide steps that smelled like lemon oil on Sundays. My father's study held dark wood and quiet rules. My mother's calendar ruled everything else. We were 5 people who posed well in photographs and moved like strangers between them. My brother learned early how to stretch on the couch and talk about potential. My sister learned that tears could buy plane tickets. I learned that effort buys silence. At 12, I brought home a medal from a debate tournament and placed it on the kitchen counter by the coffee maker, a little scrap of proof before school. My mother moved it to the junk drawer so the island would look clean for guests. When I was 16 and our team won nationals, my parents missed the ceremony for my brother's Saturday soccer game. "He needs our support," my mother said, as if I didn't. When college letters came, Harvard looked like a door and felt like a dare. My father asked how much scholarship money I'd secured already, balancing the ledger in his head. I nodded, accepted the math, and worked nights while Nathaniel learned golf and Olivia painted in Paris. I am a corporate attorney by trade and by temperament. Words paper the architecture of consequence. It all makes sense to me. I never minded the 80-hour weeks because a courtroom doesn't ask where your father dines. It asks whether your argument holds. Last month, when I closed an international merger that saved jobs and made the business pages a partner, shook my hand and said, "Welcome." That morning, an invitation with my mother's calligraphy arrived on cream stock. The drive to Greenwich felt like visiting a museum where I'm not sure I like the art anymore. The hedges were trimmed to military exactness. A Bentley and an empty space waited in the driveway as though a lesson required props. I sat in my car for a breath, smoothing the sleeve of my navy suit, the one that makes even doubt stand straighter. The door opened before I could knock. My mother air-kissed the air beside my cheek, leaving her perfume where a hug should be. "Right on time," she said, which is not a compliment in that house so much as an evaluation. My father stood in the living room with a glass of 18-year Scotch posture cut to his tailor's liking. His hair, his cuffs, his tone, everything said control. He handed me Chardonnay without meeting me in the eyes for more than a second. We spoke of weather patterns and market murmurs, neighbors who had divorced like people who had moved to a smaller planet. Nothing about the headline that still smelled like ink. 30 minutes later, the doorbell announced the favored son. Nathaniel arrived with his easy grin and his wife's soft laugh. 2 little boys colliding with their grandparents' knees like a greeting card come to life. Olivia entered last late on purpose, trailing a bohemian dress, and a man named Paolo, who presented wine with both hands as though he were offering a crown. They were welcomed with warmth that felt like heat lamps. I held my glass the way you hold a shield. When we moved to the dining room, the table looked ceremonial. Heavy mahogany thin china candles reflected in cut glass, the quiet choreography of a housekeeper setting and retreating. The conversation swirled without me. Nathaniel detailed a client he almost had. His wife described the boy's school with words like enrichment. Olivia painted her next exhibition with air, while Paolo nodded like a metronome. When the talk turned against the current toward me, my mother asked, "How's that case the way one asks about the weather in a city where one does not live?" Before I could say it had concluded successfully, my father told a story about a lawyer friend's new house on Martha's Vineyard, and dessert arrived like a curtain. Elizabeth, the documents, my father said, gentle as a gavel. My mother excused herself and returned with the portfolio, leather-smooth corners, squared embossed with his attorney's insignia. She placed it where a centerpiece might go. My father folded his hands. "We've been doing some estate planning," he began, as if the phrase had not always been a weapon in our world. "The Greenwich home, Nantucket Vale, the investment accounts, the art collection, the entirety will go to Nathaniel and Olivia. If cruelty has a scent, it is sometimes gardenia over warm china." I felt my jaw set, while everything else inside me loosened. The entirety, I asked, sane, and even the way a good lawyer checks a clause before she accepts a term she cannot live with. "You won't get a single cent," my mother said, and her voice was a mirror with no reflection. Nathaniel examined his fingernails as though a faint imperfection had just appeared. Caroline studied her plate like it might reveal an exit. Olivia looked past me at the window where the backyard lamps lit geometry across the lawn. "You're established," my father offered, as if consolation were currency. "Your brother has the boys to consider. Your sister's art requires ongoing support." He spoke like weather, a system passing through that no one could change. My mother opened the portfolio and turned the signed pages as if she were reading a menu aloud. Names, properties, percentages, clean handwriting, over a dirty intent. Not one mention of the desk where I had learned to love words. Not the pearls my grandmother promised by name. Not a token, not a keepsake, not a syllable with my name on it. "It makes sense," Nathaniel said, arranging his face into concern. "You've always been so independent." Olivia added something about Nantucket and how I never came anyway, which is easier to say than "I forgot to invite you," and the silver flashed against the candlelight as if even the cutlery had picked a side. Humiliation, I've learned, doesn't shout. It moves like cold water down the back, the kind that takes your breath. I looked at each of them, at the props, the china, the choices, and understood the script. This wasn't information. It was theater. They wanted me to sit through it, to absorb it, to clap at the end, and drive home well-behaved. I set my napkin down and found my own voice where I always keep it, just behind my calm. "All right," I said, and I smiled because dignity is a kind of armor. "Then don't expect a single cent from me either." "Kristen, don't be dramatic," my mother said, and her frown barely wrinkled the makeup she wore like a shield. "I'm being precise," I answered. "You've shown me your priorities. I'm adjusting mine." I placed my fork parallel to my knife anchors aligned and stood. "Sit down," my father ordered, the command polished by years of rooms that obeyed him. "We're finished," I said, and every syllable carried the weight of billable hours I would never see from this family. "Thank you for dinner, and for clarity." I walked through the kitchen with measured steps and told the housekeeper good night, because kindness should not be collateral. In the foyer, the marble seemed colder than it had on the way in, or maybe I was just done mistaking shine for warmth. I opened the front door to a spring evening that smelled like clipped grass and someone else's roses, and the quiet reached into my chest where a storm had been brewing for years. Backstory will tell you who you are. Injustice tells you who they think you are. The driveway stretched longer than it had when I learned to ride a bike on the gravel. My car waited with its patient little interior light. I slid behind the wheel and shut the door, and the house with its lighted windows became a painting through glass. The first tears didn't arrive as sobbing. They came as heat sudden and unstoppable from a place far younger than my suit and my cases and the headline that morning. I gripped the steering wheel and let my forehead rest there, and the leather carried a faint scent of last winter. If you've sat where I was sitting, you know the quiet that follows an insult so big, it rearranges the room. In that quiet, even the engine sounds too loud. The gate clicked open with the remote civilized as ever, and the tires eased onto the road. As I turned onto the side street where the old maples arched like ribs, my phone lit the console, a strip of white in the dark. Jessica's name glowed. I stared until it stopped, then tapped to call back, because some doors you close and some you open wide. "I'm on my way home," I told her when she answered, and my voice sounded new to me, steady, flat, honest. "How was it?" she asked, and in the pause I measured how many pieces of that night belonged to me, and how many I was about to give away. "It was a performance," I said finally, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. They cut me out on purpose, and I think they wanted me to applaud. Streetlights slid across the dashboard like slow waves. Somewhere behind me, candles continued to burn on a table, no longer set for me. I tightened my grip on the wheel and blinked away what remained of the blur. The lane widened, the turn signal clicked, and the quiet made room for a thought I had never allowed to finish forming. I could choose a different script. I merged onto the parkway toward Boston, the radio off the road ahead, clean and long. The house receded in the rear view until it was just a shape between trees, then nothing at all. The engine found its hum. My heartbeat found its pace. In the space where a daughter learns to beg, something steadier settled in. I didn't yet know how far I would take that steadiness, or what it would cost, only that it was mine. By the time the city's first lights pricked the horizon, the phone lit again, numbers I didn't recognize, names I knew all too well. I let it ring, the screen dimming to black as the road opened up before me and the night laid out its measured, patient miles. Jessica's apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain when I arrived that night. She had already poured 2 glasses of wine and left the door unlocked, knowing I wouldn't want to talk right away. I sank into the sofa, still wearing the navy suit that had witnessed every word of that dinner. For a long while, we sat in silence, the only sound the hum of traffic 3 floors below. When I finally spoke, the words came out flat. They invited me just to tell me I'm not in the will. Jessica didn't try to fill the space with sympathy. She just nodded her jaw tight and said, "Then that's on them, not you." The simplicity of it broke something open inside me. For years, I'd waited for my family to see me, to call what I'd built real. That night, the waiting ended. Later, when I tried to sleep on her couch, the city's glow spilled through the blinds, cutting thin silver lines across the floor. My phone vibrated with incoming messages: Nathaniel's predictable condescension, Olivia's clipped defense of Mom and Dad's decision. I turned the screen face down and let the sound die out. Somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, I made a decision I would not let their version of me define the rest of my life. The next morning, I returned to Boston before sunrise. The drive north felt like clearing fog. Mile by mile, the weight lifted. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that once felt lonely, but now felt earned. I brewed coffee, opened my laptop, and buried myself in work until the clock read past noon. By evening, the ache had dulled into something sharper clarity. I didn't block my family's numbers right away. I wanted to see if anyone would reach out beyond obligation. Days passed. Nothing. The silence confirmed what I had always known: my usefulness had been mistaken for love. So I started untangling the ties myself. I changed my personal email, updated legal contacts, and requested to be removed from my parents' country club membership, one of the last threads connecting me to their world of manicured pretense. At the firm, life went on. Case files stacked high, assistants moved with quiet efficiency, and my new title partner appeared under my nameplate like it had always been there. Still, Diane, my assistant, sensed something had shifted. She brought coffee without being asked, handled calls, and offered the kind of silent understanding that friendship doesn't require words to express. 4 days after the dinner, an unfamiliar number appeared on my office phone. I almost ignored it, but something habit maybe made me pick up. "Miss Walker?" A man's voice asked, smooth and steady. "This is Thomas Aldridge from Aldridge, Bennett & Shaw." The name meant nothing to me. "Yes, I represent several clients in Greenwich who have worked with your parents. I came across information that might concern you personally." The pause that followed stretched long enough for the air to change. "If this is about my family's affairs," I said carefully, "I'm not involved." "Understood," he replied. "But this information concerns what you were told, or rather what you weren't told." We arranged to meet halfway at a small cafe just off the interstate. The place was quiet, all brick walls and low light, the kind where conversations stay private. Thomas arrived precisely on time, gray suit, calm eyes, a man who had practiced discretion long enough to make it seem effortless. He spoke without the pretense I was used to. "I can't share client confidences, but much of this is public record. Your parents' finances aren't what they appear to be." He slid a folder across the table. "Mortgage records, liens, partnership losses, all there in black and white. The Greenwich house had been refinanced 3 times. The Nantucket property carried a heavy lien. Several of my father's ventures were in default." Thomas explained quietly. "Your father's firm took major hits after the market downturn. Rather than scaling back, he borrowed heavily to sustain the image." For a moment, I just stared at the pages. So, the empire they cut me out of may not exist. He finished gently. Outside, a light rain had started. The sound against the windows filled the pause between us. "Why tell me?" I asked. "Because fairness matters," he said simply. "And because I know what families like that can do to people who tell the truth." On the drive home, the world outside my windshield blurred into soft gray. The anger that had burned in me since the dinner began to shift into something quieter, steadier. They hadn't just excluded me, they'd done it to hide their own collapse. My absence from the will wasn't punishment, it was camouflage. By the time I reached my apartment, the decision had already taken shape. I would let the silence continue. Let the perfect image unravel on its own. No confrontation, no announcements, just distance. I deleted the last family group chat from my phone, canceled the autopay that funded Olivia's forgotten art charity, and handed Diane a short list of names to block on my office line. Weeks passed like that, quiet, ordered, almost peaceful. I worked late, met Jessica for dinner, and started seeing someone new, an architect named David, who talked more about buildings than people. His calmness felt like safety. Then one Tuesday morning, the phone rang again. Diane appeared in the doorway, her expression uneasy. "It's Greenwich Memorial Hospital," she said softly. "They say it's urgent." I picked up the call with the detached reflex of a lawyer. The voice on the other end belonged to a nurse. "Miss Walker, your father, Harold Walker, was admitted last night following a severe stroke. You're listed as next of kin." The words landed like a dropped stone in still water. No splash, just ripples spreading outward. My father, the man who could command a boardroom with a look, now unconscious in a hospital bed. I left within the hour. The drive back to Connecticut felt longer than it had 2 weeks earlier. By the time I reached the hospital, the world outside had turned overcast. My mother sat in the waiting area, hair undone, eyes red but dry. For the first time in my life, she looked small. "Kristen," she said, rising, her voice shaking. You came. What happened? The market crashed again, she murmured. Harold was at his desk when it happened. They said it was stress. He collapsed before the housekeeper found him. I asked about Nathaniel and Olivia. She hesitated. Nathaniel's in London. He said he'll try to come by the weekend. Olivia's in Provence with Paolo. The waiting room clock ticked in slow rhythm as we sat together. When the doctor appeared, I stood to meet him. The stroke had been significant, he explained. But there was brain activity signs of possible recovery with therapy. Still, it would take months of care and rehabilitation. Insurance, he added carefully, wouldn't cover much of it. That night in a hospital corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and loss, my mother's composure cracked. Kristen, we're in trouble, she said, her voice trembling. The accounts are frozen. Credit cards declined. I don't know how we'll pay for this. It was the first honest sentence she'd spoken to me in years. Talk to Nathaniel? I said quietly. She shook her head. He says his money's tied up in investments. He can send $10,000 for now. Olivia has nothing. The image of the dinner table came back, silver glinting documents signed, the smug certainty in every voice. I almost laughed. So the empire fell apart. Her eyes filled, but she didn't deny it. Please, she whispered. I don't know what to do. The daughter she had dismissed sat across from her now, holding the pieces together. Every instinct told me to walk away. But another voice, the one that still believed in doing what was right even when no one deserved it, spoke louder. I need full access to his financial records, I said. Bank statements, property files, everything. And I'll speak with the billing department about payment plans. For the next 3 days, I worked as if on autopilot, reading, calculating tracing lines from one bad decision to the next. The Greenwich house was mortgaged to the hilt. The vacation properties carried liens. My father had borrowed to maintain appearances, betting the future against his pride. Each discovery peeled back another layer of the image I'd grown up under. My brother's career had been buoyed by bailouts. Olivia's art galleries were shells financed entirely through grants that my father had written himself under different names. They had built their success on scaffolding I was never allowed to touch. By the 4th day, my father's condition stabilized. I sat beside his bed, the steady rhythm of machines marking time. His face, always composed, now looked strangely human, the weight of pretense gone. I studied his hand, still strong, though motionless, and wondered what it meant to help people who had made a life of never helping you. The lawyer in me ran numbers. The daughter in me remembered that I had once wanted him to be proud. Between those two truths, I made a choice. I called Jessica that night. I'm going to help them, I said. After everything she asked quietly. I'm not doing it for them, I said. I'm doing it so I can live with myself. Outside the hospital window, spring rain fell against the glass in soft lines. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped in steady rhythm, matching my heartbeat. I didn't know what forgiveness looked like yet, or if it was even possible, but I knew this walking away would have turned me into someone I didn't want to become. The house in Greenwich would have to be untangled, piece by piece, the same way you undo a knot that's been pulled too tight. But first, I stood in the doorway of the ICU room, looking at the man who once taught me that strength meant silence, and whispered, "We start here." He didn't stir, but his hand moved faintly, a small twitch that could have been nothing or everything. In that small motion, the air shifted. Somewhere between resentment and duty, something new took root. Not love, not yet, but something close to resolve, steady and unspoken, waiting for its turn to grow. The hospital became my second office in the weeks that followed. I moved between legal contracts and medical charts, between late-night conference calls and the steady hum of machines keeping my father alive. Each day began with coffee from the cafeteria and ended with a stack of financial documents waiting on the narrow table beside his bed. The staff began to recognize me, the daughter who never left, always writing, always asking questions. The nurses spoke to me in low, respectful voices, as if they understood that competence was the only armor I had left. My mother drifted in and out, her perfume lingering long after she left a room, still trying to keep up the illusion of control. But when she thought no one was looking, I'd catch her standing by the window, twisting her wedding ring like a rosary. By the end of the first week, I had pieced together enough of my parents' finances to see the full picture. The Greenwich house was mortgaged 3 times over. The vacation properties were underwater, each carrying debts disguised as renovation loans. My father's accounts were riddled with risky investments that had turned into quiet losses. For years, he had been borrowing against an image, using the past to fund the pretense of stability. I worked late into the night, the sound of the monitors blending with the scratching of my pen. Each figure I wrote down felt like a nail in the coffin of the life they had built. But I kept going, because if I stopped, the silence would bring back the memory of that dinner, the one where I learned exactly how disposable I was. On the 12th day, Nathaniel finally arrived. His cologne reached the room before he did, sharp and expensive, as if money could disguise the staleness of guilt. "What are you doing here?" he asked, setting his overnight bag on the chair I had been using as a desk. "Cleaning up," I said, without looking up from the spreadsheet. "Cleaning up what?" "The mess," I answered. "Where have you been?" He sighed, the sound rehearsed. "In London. Important clients. You know how it is." "Of course," I said. "Too important to pick up the phone." He glanced at our father, pale and motionless in the bed, then back at me. "How bad is it?" "Worse than you think," I said. "And since you and Olivia are the named heirs, that makes it your problem too." He frowned, the words landing harder than he expected. "Named heirs, Dad and Mom's will," I said quietly. "The one they invited me to dinner to announce?" Color drained from his face. "You're joking." "I'm not." I turned the laptop toward him. "These are the numbers. Every mortgage, every loan, every account that's about to default. If we don't act fast, the bank takes the house." Nathaniel rubbed a hand over his face, disbelief replacing arrogance. "That can't be right. Dad always had everything planned." "Appearances can't pay interest," I said. When I told him that I had been covering the hospital bills myself for nearly 2 weeks, he looked at me like I'd spoken another language. "I'll contribute something," he said, after a long silence. "But things are tight right now. Tuition, the new house." $5,000 a month, I said, cutting him off. "That's your share." $5,000? Are you serious?" "Completely." I looked him in the eye. "If you can't manage that, sell something you don't need." His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had no argument. 3 days later, Olivia arrived in a cloud of perfume and panic. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors, carrying an art supply tote that looked like it had never seen paint. She hugged our mother, wept softly, and made a show of sitting beside our father's bed. But by that evening, she was in the cafeteria complaining about airline fees and asking whether the gallery in Manhattan could stay open while she figured things out. When I told her we'd have to close it, she stared at me as though I'd committed a crime. "You can't. I have grants pending." I looked up from the laptop. "What grants?" "The ones Dad helps me write," she said. "He always reviewed them before I submitted." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like a student explaining a familiar routine, but something in the way she said grants made me dig deeper. Within an hour, I found the truth. Her so-called funding came directly from my father's personal account, disguised as third-party awards. When I showed her the records, she blinked rapidly, trying to process it. So, I've never actually won anything. I hesitated. Not outside this family, no. She pressed her hands over her face and whispered, Then what have I been doing all this time? For once, I had no answer. Watching her crumble, I felt a flicker of something I didn't expect: pity. Not for her ignorance, but for the hollow world our parents had built around her. Days folded into weeks. My father regained consciousness slowly. His words thick and slurred. The first time he spoke my name, it came out like a question. Kristen. I'm here, I said, leaning closer. His eyes moved toward the stack of papers beside his bed. Why here? Because someone had to be, I said. He studied my face with the effort of a man climbing a steep hill. After dinner. Terrible thing. Yes, I said softly. It was. His hand trembled until I took it in mine. Always proud of you? He whispered the words, uneven but clear. Never said. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to believe him, but the damage between us was older than his illness. I let him rest, unsure whether the confession was real or born of regret. Later that night, my mother joined me in his office, the same room where he had built his empire one call at a time. We were sorting through papers when I found a locked drawer. Inside was a folder labeled simply Kristen. Inside, yellowed clippings of my debate wins my graduation photo and every article that had ever mentioned my name. My mother's hand went to her mouth. He kept all this. I stared at the evidence of attention I'd never known existed. Why hide it? She sank into the chair across from me, the one my father had used for decades. Harold has always struggled to show pride. He believed you were the strongest, that you didn't need the praise your brother and sister did. That's a convenient story, I said more sharply than I intended. Not a story, she said quietly. An explanation. Her voice broke on the last word, and for the first time, I saw not the woman who ran charity galas, but a wife who had spent years living inside someone else's design. We failed you, she said, eyes on the floor. Both of us, in different ways. The following week, I set a rhythm for everyone. Nathaniel was to handle immediate expenses, finally wiring the promised $5,000. Olivia would assist at the rehabilitation center, giving our mother a break. It wasn't much, but it was structure, and structure was what our family had always lacked. One afternoon, my father asked to see me alone. His speech was still slow, but his eyes had regained focus. Why? Cut you out? He asked, his brow furrowing as if the question belonged to someone else. I was hoping you could tell me, I said. He struggled for a moment, his good hand clutching the blanket. Pride, he said at last. Didn't want you to see failure. I sat in silence, letting the words settle. He went on each syllable, careful. Nathaniel knew, needed money. Olivia too. But you, successful. Couldn't let you see me, ruined. It was so absurd, so human that I almost laughed. So you cut me out to protect your pride. He nodded, shame darkening his face. Dinner was act. Make it look like choice. I exhaled slowly. The truth didn't fix anything, but it gave shape to the chaos I'd carried for years. He hadn't hated me. He'd been afraid of me, afraid of my independence, of the mirror I held up to the life he'd built on illusion. When I left his room that night, the sky outside was a deep, calm blue. I walked past the nurse's station, past the quiet hum of machines, and stepped into the small courtyard where the first hints of spring were beginning to show. The air smelled faintly of earth and rain. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe without the weight of anger pressing on my chest. I didn't know what forgiveness would look like, not yet. But I knew this something had shifted. The silence that once felt like punishment now felt like space, and in that space, there was room for something new to grow. Autumn came early that year, the air turning cool enough that the leaves along the hospital drive began to rust before September ended. I spent my mornings between two worlds, the clinical brightness of my father's rehabilitation sessions and the quiet rhythm of his finances unraveling in my hands. Each day, I uncovered new debts, hidden behind polished smiles and charity donations, new promises made on credit to maintain a reputation no one could afford anymore. I had taken a leave from the firm to work remotely, setting up a small desk in my old bedroom. The same wallpaper I'd stared at as a teenager still clung to the walls, faded blue vines that now looked smaller, easier to outgrow. My mother moved through the hallways, like someone learning to live in her own home again. She had traded her pearls for reading glasses, her manicured calm for late-night questions about things she'd never understood. We spent long evenings at the dining table, surrounded by ledgers and loan statements, her notebook filled with numbers she wrote twice, just to be sure. One night, she laid her pen down and stared at the ceiling. "I never wanted to know all this," she said quietly. "Your father handled the money, I handled the appearances. That was our deal." I looked at her, tired, but finally honest. "It left you vulnerable," I said. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I realize that now. When I wasn't managing bills or reviewing contracts, I met with bankers and creditors, leveraging every ounce of legal knowledge I had to buy us time. I convinced them that my father's reputation still meant something, that he was recovering, that we were reorganizing. It was part truth, part mercy, part strategy. 2 weeks into this routine, Nathaniel reappeared, his return marked by the sound of his shoes echoing too confidently down the hospital corridor. He wore his usual veneer of control, but it cracked when he saw me sitting beside our father sorting through insurance forms. So he said, setting down his briefcase, "You've made yourself the family treasurer now." "Someone had to," I said without looking up. "I'm here to help," he offered, pulling up a chair. "Just tell me what needs to be done." I told him 10,000 by Friday, 5,000 monthly afterward. The color drained from his face. "That's not possible. Caroline and I are expenses." "Then change them," I said. "Dad doesn't need another appearance of success. He needs medical care." He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. But when I turned back to the paperwork, he said nothing else. It was an agreement, but it was a start. Olivia came back a few days later, eyes, red hair, tied back, looking smaller than I remembered. She sat beside my mother and held her hand like a child. "I found out about the grants," she said softly. "The fake ones." My mother's eyes filled. "He only wanted you to believe you could do it." "I could have," Olivia said, her voice breaking, "if anyone had actually let me try." For the first time in years, the three of us, my mother, my sister, and I, sat together without pretense. The house was quieter than I'd ever known it. And somehow, that quiet began to feel like healing. By the end of the month, my father was strong enough to move from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility. He still struggled with words, but his clarity was returning. When he spoke, he chose his sentences carefully, like a man rediscovering the cost of them. One afternoon, while the therapist adjusted his walking brace, he motioned for me to stay behind. When the room emptied, he reached for my hand. "Why? Still here?" he asked, voice halting. "Because someone needed to make things right," I said. His eyes stayed on me a long time. After what I did? Why? Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. He nodded slowly, his eyes wet. I was ashamed, he whispered. Didn't want you to see me fail. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was truth. And for the first time, truth was enough. Weeks passed. The rhythm of recovery became our new normal therapy sessions, phone calls, bills. My mother learned to budget. Nathaniel began selling off investments that no longer paid for themselves. Olivia closed her gallery and started taking business classes online, determined to learn how to stand on her own. The family that had once lived by illusion was finally learning humility in pieces. And in the midst of that slow reckoning, something unexpected began to happen. Peace. One evening, I stood in the garden behind the house, the same place my mother once hosted summer parties under white tents. The grass was patchy now, the lights long gone, but the air was still and full of the faint scent of the season's last roses. My father joined me, moving carefully with his cane. He looked around as though seeing his life for the first time, without the noise. I used to think success was noise, he said slowly. The clinking glasses, the applause. But this, he gestured toward the fading sunset, this feels more real. I didn't answer. There was nothing to add. Later that week, I arranged a meeting with the bank to finalize the restructuring of their debt. The same banker who once toasted my father at country club events now sat across from me, deferential, careful with his words. My father's power had always been in the room he entered. Mine, I realized, was in the calm I carried into it. The numbers worked out, barely but enough. We would keep the Greenwich House reduced staff, sell the Nantucket and Vale properties, and liquidate portions of the art collection. It wasn't victory. It was survival, but survival with dignity. By October, my father was back home. He still tired easily, but the worst had passed. My mother had replaced the framed portraits of charity events with family photographs I didn't remember ever being taken, snapshots from birthdays, graduations. Small moments that had once gone unnoticed. One evening, she asked me to join her and my father in the garden again. He was walking more steadily now, his cane barely touching the ground. My mother carried a thin envelope with the embossed seal of a law firm I didn't recognize. My father handed it to me. New will, he said simply. Inside, 3 names appeared, Nathaniel, Olivia, and mine. Equal shares. I looked up, unsure what to say. It isn't about the money, my mother said quietly. It's about fairness, about respect. I folded the document and slipped it into my bag. Then let's start there, I said. They nodded, and for once the silence between us didn't hurt. It held possibility. Later that night, I stood in the upstairs hallway listening to the faint hum of the house settling. Somewhere, a clock chimed. I leaned against the banister and realized that I no longer felt like a guest in my own family's story. For years, I had waited for them to see me. Now I understood something simpler and stronger. I didn't need their approval to belong here. I already did by choice, not inheritance. Downstairs, the light in my father's study flickered off. My mother's footsteps crossed the kitchen, soft and unhurried. I stayed there a moment longer, feeling the weight of the past year settle into something gentler. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. When I finally went to bed, the night air carried the scent of rain through the open window. I thought about the woman who had once driven away from this house, shaking with anger, and realized she would hardly recognize the one who returned. The wounds were still there, but so was something steadier, a quiet understanding that dignity could exist even after betrayal, that compassion could coexist with boundaries. And somewhere between that knowing and the sound of the rain, I drifted to sleep, unaware that the next season would bring the moment I had never expected: recognition, not through apology, but through gratitude. The morning light came softly through the kitchen windows, spreading across the counters, where coffee steamed beside a bowl of cranberries. The house was warm again, not because of luxury or grandeur, but because it finally sounded like life inside. Somewhere upstairs, my mother hummed while setting the table. In the living room, my father's cane tapped lightly against the wood floor, the rhythm even steady, determined. It had been 6 months since the stroke. 6 months since the night my family's world cracked open. The cracks had never been sealed. They'd simply become part of the design. I'd learned that some fractures don't need mending, they just need light to pass through them differently. By late afternoon, the kitchen was crowded with small, imperfect moments. Nathaniel and Caroline were helping the twins place napkins at each setting. Olivia stood by the stove, hair pulled back, stirring gravy with a focus that made her seem older. My mother, apron tied too tight, gave quiet directions but not commands. The air smelled of rosemary and roasted turkey. Jessica arrived first, holding a pie she'd made that morning. "You're early," I teased, taking her coat. She smiled. I wanted to see it for myself. The famous Walker dinner, no shouting, no posturing. "Miracles do happen," I said, laughing softly. Thomas came a few minutes later, his presence calm as ever. He greeted everyone like they were already friends, not the remnants of a family once split by pride. When he took my hand, my mother noticed, and I saw something new in her face. Relief, maybe even gratitude. Dinner began just after sunset. The chandelier cast a gentler glow, now that half the bulbs had been replaced with warmer ones. My father insisted on carving the turkey himself, his movements slow but sure. The room went quiet as he set down the first slice and looked around the table. "To family," he said, his voice carrying the weight of things learned too late. "To rebuilding what matters." Glasses lifted. The clink that followed wasn't grand or ceremonial, just the sound of fragile things held together long enough to mean something. As we ate, the conversation drifted easily between laughter and silence. Nathaniel spoke about a new position he'd taken teaching finance to high school students, a job that came with less prestige but more meaning. Olivia shared sketches for a design project, her first paying commission since closing the gallery. My mother told us she'd joined a local charity organizing fundraisers for community health programs. Her pride was quieter now, rooted in purpose instead of presentation. I caught my father watching her, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. He still spoke slowly, words deliberate, but there was gentleness in his restraint. When he raised his glass again, it was only halfway full. "To Kristen," he said, the syllables careful but clear. Who reminded us what family really means when we'd forgotten. No one looked at me right away, and that was what made it bearable. It wasn't a performance, it was truth plain and heavy in the air. I nodded once enough to acknowledge the sentiment without turning it into a scene. Across the table, Jessica caught my eye and smiled. The moment passed quietly, like a breeze through open curtains. After dinner, we moved to the living room where logs crackled in the fireplace. The twins built a tower of wooden blocks beside the hearth, while Olivia helped my mother clear dishes. My father sat in his armchair, the same one where he used to read the Wall Street Journal every morning. This time, he simply watched the fire. Thomas joined me by the window. The garden outside was mostly bare now, save for the outline of roses clinging to the last of autumn. "It's different here," he said softly. "It is," I replied. "It finally feels lived in." We stood in silence, watching the sky fade to gray-blue. Inside, my family moved around one another without pretense, like a slow dance no one had to rehearse. Later, when the dishes were washed and the house quieted again, my mother pulled me aside to the library. She held a folded sheet of paper in her hand. "I wrote something," she said, hesitating before handing it to me. I'm not good with words the way you are, but I wanted you to have this. It was a letter, simple hand, written, no flourishes. She apologized without excuses, thanked me for coming back when she would have understood if I hadn't, and promised to keep learning what love looks like without control. Her signature was shaky, but the ink had dried perfectly. When I looked up, she was studying my face like she wasn't sure she deserved a reaction. I folded the paper gently. You already said it, I told her. This just makes it easier to remember. She exhaled slowly and smiled the kind of smile that comes when you finally stop pretending. By the time everyone left, the house had gone quiet again. My father had dozed off by the fire, my mother humming softly as she tidied the last few glasses. I stepped outside to the porch, wrapping my sweater tighter against the cool air. The neighborhood was still. A thin layer of frost shimmered on the grass. The sky above was deep and clean, a wash of indigo and faint stars. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider here. I had stopped measuring my worth by anyone's acknowledgement, even theirs. It wasn't forgiveness that gave me peace, it was the choice to stop needing repayment for what they couldn't give. A soft creak behind me made me turn. My father stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame for balance. You okay? He asked, his voice rough but gentle. I am, I said. Really? He nodded, then looked toward the night sky. You were right, he murmured, about everything. I just wish I'd said it sooner. Now is enough, I replied. He reached for my shoulder, a tentative, awkward gesture, and I covered his hand with mine. For once, there was no tension, no unfinished argument between us, just quiet understanding under the chill of the evening air. When he finally went back inside, I stayed a while longer. Through the window, I saw my family gathered near the fire again, my mother placing a blanket over his legs, Olivia laughing softly at something Nathaniel said. The scene glowed warm against the dark, a life rebuilt not by perfection, but by persistence. Thomas stepped onto the porch and joined me, slipping his hand into mine. Ready to head back to Boston tomorrow? He asked. I nodded. It feels like the right time. He squeezed my hand once, no words needed. Behind us, the house settled into quiet, the kind that doesn't feel empty anymore. When I finally turned to leave, I looked back once more. Light spilled gently from the windows, catching the frost along the garden path. For years, I'd thought this house was where I lost myself. Now I realized it was simply where I learned who I was without their permission. Peace, I've learned, doesn't mean forgetting. It means standing in the same place that once broke you and knowing you're no longer fragile. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you've ever had to rebuild peace on your own terms, share it below. Maybe someone out there needs to hear it tonight. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep your quiet strength close.